The most brutal, most emotionally devastating Ninja Turtles story ever put on paper. A novel that basically proved this franchise could go toe-to-toe with the darkest DC and Marvel comics, just got quietly shelved by Paramount, and the way it happened tells you everything about how Hollywood actually works right now. The Last Ronin is a 5-issue miniseries that TMNT co-creator Kevin Eastman wrote alongside Tom Waltz, and it does something no mainstream Turtles story had done since the very first black and white Mirage comics from the mid-80s. It goes completely dark. Set in a dystopian future version of New York ruled by Oroku Hiroto, the grandson of Shredder, the story follows the only surviving turtle on a solo revenge mission against the man who murdered his 3 brothers and Splinter. He carries all 4 weapons, he fights alone, he has almost nothing left to lose. It reads like a war movie filtered through a superhero lens, and it won over a massive audience, selling out multiple print runs and spawning a prequel series called Lost Years in 2023 and a sequel called Re-Evolution in 2024. Eastman has even confirmed a 3rd chapter is coming. The Roninverse has been growing steadily, and for a while, it really looked like that momentum was going to carry into a live-action film. In early 2024, Paramount officially confirmed the adaptation. The Hollywood Reporter reported that Walter Hamada, who ran DC Films during the Snyder era and knew exactly how to handle mature, violent genre material, was on board as producer. Tyler Burton Smith, who wrote Boy Kills World, was handling the screenplay, and Ilya Naishuller, the Russian director behind Nobody, was reportedly in talks to direct. If you know Nobody, you know exactly what kind of brutal, hyper-stylized action Naishuller brings to a project. The casting was perfect on paper. For months, insiders kept quietly confirming the film was alive and progressing. There was even a period where James Wan's name circulated as a potential director, which made sense given his long working relationship with Hamada going back to Aquaman. Then everything stopped. Variety confirmed that Paramount put a pin in plans for the R-rated Last Ronin adaptation, noting that the project remains in development as something to potentially revisit in the future, though it likely won't be anytime soon. The timing lines up directly with the Skydance merger completing in August 2024 and new studio leadership reassessing every major project on the slate. According to sources close to the production, the new regime wasn't keen on having the first non-animated Turtles movie in nearly a decade be a bloody, adult-skewing story, and one insider noted the studio wants to leave the door open to possibly revisit it later. So, what replaced it? Paramount announced an untitled live-action and CG hybrid Ninja Turtles movie produced by Neil Moritz, the franchise producer behind the money-printing Sonic trilogy and Fast and Furious, signaling a push for 4-quadrant crowd-pleasing spectacle. That film is officially in development and set for release on November 17th, 2028, and it will combine live-action performances with CGI animation to bring the Turtles world to life for audiences of all ages. The comparison Paramount executives have drawn publicly is to Bumblebee, the 2018 Travis Knight film that rebooted the Transformers franchise with a softer, more emotionally grounded tone set against an 80s backdrop. And here's where that comparison gets a little uncomfortable. Bumblebee grossed $470 million worldwide on a $135 million production budget, becoming the lowest grossing film in the Transformers franchise, even though critics loved it and audiences responded warmly. But it didn't make the kind of money that justifies a full trilogy, and the trilogy that was originally planned around it never materialized. So when Paramount holds up Bumblebee as the creative benchmark for what they want from a TMNT reboot, it sounds inspiring on the surface, but it also raises the obvious question of whether they've actually thought through the risk they're trying to avoid. Meanwhile, the argument for keeping The Last Ronin on the table is sitting right there in the numbers. Mutant Mayhem grossed $120 million in US and Canada and $62 million internationally for a worldwide total of $180 million, and Deadline calculated the film's net profit at $205 million when accounting for streaming, home media, and the more than 400 merchandise licenses tied to the film. That's actually an impressive result, especially on a $70 million production budget, but it's still not the kind of theatrical monster that makes a studio double down on a franchise immediately. The film debuted the same summer as Barbenheimer, got hit with a writer's strike that prevented Seth Rogen and the cast from doing any press, and still managed to land with critics as the best reviewed Turtles movie ever made. Its sequel is already dated for August 2027, so the animated branch of the franchise is alive and well, but none of that explains why a completely separate, tonally distinct R-rated film can't coexist with it. And that's the part that's genuinely hard to understand from a creative standpoint. Paramount itself has floated the idea internally that 2 separate TMNT universes could run simultaneously. The family-friendly animated and hybrid live-action lane on one side, and a darker, mature prestige project on the other. It's not even that unusual a model. Sony has been doing something similar with Spider-Man for years, running the MCU version and the animated Spider-Verse films and the Venom and Kraven movies all at the same time, in completely disconnected continuities. But it requires a studio that's actually committed to both tracks. And right now, Paramount's commitment to The Last Ronin feels pretty one-sided. Kevin Eastman himself said in February that he doesn't believe the movie is off the table, describing it more as a delay than a cancellation and saying he thinks it will happen. Coming from one of the original creators who's deeply embedded in the production side of the franchise, that's not nothing. The whole situation puts Paramount in an interesting position. The studio came out of the Skydance merger with aggressive energy and some genuinely ambitious goals. New Skydance leadership has made it clear they prefer building structured cinematic universes with long-term planning rather than one-off films that don't connect to anything. If that mindset gets applied to Turtles properly, the next iteration could be built as a multi-phase plan from the ground up, with tighter connections between movies, shows, and games. A hybrid live-action reboot produced by Neil Moritz would be the logical starting point for that kind of architecture. Moritz knows how to run franchises. Fast and Furious lasted 11 films, and Sonic is now a trilogy, so if anyone understands the machinery of building something that lasts, it's him. But Paramount doesn't necessarily want to kill The Last Ronin forever. They want the new reboot to land first, establish a fresh general audience connection to the Turtles, and then potentially use that success to justify the riskier, darker project as a prestige companion piece a few years down the line. That's actually a reasonable strategy. If the 2028 hybrid film performs well and reignites mainstream interest in the franchise, a 2030 Last Ronin aimed at adults who grew up on the comics becomes a much easier sell to shareholders than it would be right now. The problem is that every year, this thing sits frozen, the creative team disperses. Writers take other projects, directors attach to other films, and the very specific energy that made The Last Ronin development exciting in 2024 is harder to recreate from scratch once momentum breaks. There's also the question of what the franchise's tonal identity should be going forward. The original Mirage comics from 1984 were never meant to be kids' entertainment. They were a gritty parody of Frank Miller's Daredevil and the hyper-violent action comics of that era. The children's cartoon came later and completely transformed public perception of what the Turtles were. Every few years there's a creative attempt to pull the property back toward that darker original vision, and every time it gets close to actually happening, commercial pressure steers it back toward the safe version. The Last Ronin was the closest that darker vision has ever come to a mainstream film adaptation, and it got frozen before a single frame was shot. What makes this sting for longtime fans is that the comic proved the audience is there. The 5-issue run sold out, the follow-up books sold out. The expanded Roninverse has built a dedicated reader base that doesn't overlap much with the mutant mayhem crowd. These are adults in their 30s and 40s who grew up with the franchise and want to see it taken seriously. That's not a niche audience. That's the same demographic that turned Logan into a $619 million hit and made the first Deadpool the highest grossing R-rated film of its time. The playbook exists. Other studios have run it successfully, but Paramount keeps circling the option without committing to it. The November 2028 date for the new hybrid reboot is real and it's locked in. The Last Ronin is officially in a holding pattern with no timeline attached, and somewhere in development a third-person Michelangelo action game is slowly being built with no release window. The franchise is moving forward in multiple directions at once, but the one project that had the most creative ambition and the most built-in fan enthusiasm is sitting in a box waiting for someone at the studio to decide it's worth the risk. If Paramount genuinely believes TMNT is one of their most valuable long-term assets, and they've said exactly that publicly, then leaving the most beloved modern chapter of that franchise in limbo indefinitely isn't a strategy, it's just fear dressed up as patience.